Mm, Good afternoon, everybody. Kia ora, and welcome to the Vibe event, Be-Link Innovation, where we're actually going to talk about opportunities for businesses and native forests for with carbon removals. As people that have joined us more often, it's a Zoom webinar, but I'll explain everything when we get started. I want to tell you a little bit about Be-Link Innovation. Be-Link Innovation is a full business unit of Lincoln University. And basically what we do are three things. We bring people together. So with that, we try to connect people, because we are convinced that if we bring people together that actually share the same passion or the same question, or that suddenly, because you are connecting to each other, you start to talk to each other and you're like, perhaps we can help each other. At that moment in time, collaboration starts, and we truly believe that if you're passionate people that start to collaborate, that true innovation will actually take place. We do that here on the Lincoln University campus within the Be-Link Innovation Workshop, where we also have a co-working space and meeting rooms that you can use. So if you're in the vicinity of Lincoln University, you are extremely welcome. But before we go on, a little bit of housekeeping. Normally, I will tell you what the emergency exits are. Hopefully, the place where you are looking at this live stream, you know where the emergency exits are. If not, please familiarize yourself with that. This webinar is being recorded and will be emailed to you after, or the link of the webinar will be emailed to you. So you can actually re-watch it if you want. There is a Q&A button in the bottom of your screen. So if you move your mouse, you actually see a Q&A button. You can actually post your questions there for Nick Butcher, that I'm actually going to introduce a little bit later. You are muted as participants, but you will be able to ask the questions. And after Nick has done his presentation, we will actually go into the Q&A sessions. I will read out the questions, and hopefully Nick will be able to answer them. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker of today, Nick Butcher from CarbonCrop. Nick is the Chief Technology Officer, and he is both an engineer and an entrepreneur. And he himself, by himself, assessed 1.9 million hectares of land, and he removed about 350,000 tons of carbon. How does he do that? Well, he is using artificial intelligence and remote sensing, and he is probably going to take us on a journey. So please welcome Nick. Nick, I will stop sharing, and the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Well, I'll have to start by clarifying on the myself by myself. Like, there's a whole team of people behind me that makes CarbonCrop work, and I don't want to take the credit away from them. But yeah, collectively, we've, I think 350,000 tons is about right now. And yeah, there's also a couple of stats I'll get to later on the impact. But what I'm going to cover today is some sort of our latest thoughts on carbon removals and the opportunities that they create, both for landholders, for the ag sector, for businesses, but more broadly just for the climate overall. Like the reason that we're trying to create these markets and implement these incentive mechanisms is that we want to do something about climate change, and well, specifically we want to mitigate and minimize climate change and hopefully get climate unchanged. Sadly, we're a pretty long way from that at the moment, with the news in the Northern Hemisphere about these extreme heat waves, which are basically terrifying. But like at the moment, we're still going very much in the wrong direction. There's lots of signs of improvement, but we need to figure out a way to speed it up. And carbon removals and voluntary carbon markets and compliance carbon markets are a big part of that. As Wim said, I lead the sort of product and engineering at CarbonCrop. I'm a co-founder, and we've been implementing forest carbon solutions, especially for landholder market access, using AI. We're a spin out of the Nelson Artificial Intelligence Institute. With all that background out of the way, so this is the broader goal. Like I'm going to talk a lot about specific markets and standards and everything else, but in principle, there's roughly 1 billion hectares of marginal land on the planet which is not currently forested, could be forested and is not in competition with agricultural production, and is assessed that if it were all forested, then it could draw down on the order of 5 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. So this is in addition to all of the carbon dioxide that we could draw down through better management and restoration of existing forest land. The true numbers hopefully somewhere well above 5 billion tonnes in terms of what we can achieve. But 5 billion is kind of our pole star, like I should say Southern Cross, given where we are, but that's what we're working towards. This is why we bother, because putting that in context, global emissions today are on the order of sort of 40, 45-ish, 50 gigatons per year. So this is not going to solve climate change. We need to massively decarbonize and reduce emissions. But as you'll see in a couple of slides, we desperately need all of these carbon removals as well. So diving right into that, why bother with removals? This is a chart from the UN. I think it's a year or so old now, but basically it shows these sort of emissions pathways basically. So you can see in this one, we were up around 40-ish gigatons CO2 equivalent per year. And when the chart was created, sadly, we're actually tracking beyond this. This is a low energy demand pathway is what LED means. And this black line is net emissions overall globally, assuming that we hit that pathway. As those of you who've been tracking this, unfortunately, we're not on track for this pathway, but for argument's sake, this is a scenario consistent with keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees C above sort of the pre-industrial revolution state. What's presented here is a bunch of different bunch of different emission categories: electricity, the ubiquitous other category, buildings, transport, industry. Then there's one down the bottom, which is land use. And you'll see that at the moment, land use is actually, it's shown as a source of emissions. What this chart shows is it becoming a source of removals, like negative emissions. It might seem weird that it's a source of emissions at the moment when you consider that trees grow and they store carbon, but unfortunately at the moment, we're not storing carbon in forest in aggregate on a global level, and certainly not once we consider agricultural. We're actually losing carbon stocks through forest internationally. And what we need to do is turn that around, like take what's currently roughly a 5 gigaton source of carbon emissions and turn it into a 5 gigaton carbon sink so that it can help clean up the mess we've made historically and also start to address some of the mess we're continuing to make. And we need to do this pretty much whatever the pathway is. Like I'll come a little later on to much of the refrain recently around we need to stop focusing on offsets and avoided emissions and and removals, and instead focus on gross emissions reductions. Like we definitely need to focus on gross emissions reductions. Our emissions are far too high, and we don't have any even vaguely credible pathway to mitigating climate change unless we massively decarbonize. But for all of these different, I just picked 4 different scenarios from the UN. All of these pathways also rely on us massively increasing carbon removals in addition to decarbonizing. So there's no pathway left where we stabilize climate change just through decarbonization. We need massive removals. And this is even if you're happy with 1.5C. Like as we're seeing with the climate at the moment, 1.5C is already a disaster. Like we should be aiming to get back to where we were around 0-ish. We want to get to net negative, but part of that is getting to 0, and the key part is that carbon removals are essential to that. So I'll sort of quickly begin with a bit of background to CarbonCrop within that landscape. Carbon markets exist, and in terms of carbon incentives for forest carbon sequestration, there's sort of a couple of fairly simple components. You've got some CO2, which is in the atmosphere, and you don't want it there. You want it, well, we want some of it there. 350 parts per million would be nice, but we've got too much. We want to suck some of it out of the atmosphere, lock it up in forest. And some landholder of some form, some entity has rights to that forest. If they can get that carbon removal and durable sequestration verified, they get carbon units, which they can sell to a carbon emitter, which means that they receive funds, which means that they've both got the means and an incentive to increase the amount of carbon that they're removing and durably storing. This is the goal. This is how it works when it's working properly. What we found when we started we're doing the research to, is there something which is there a problem we can help solve here, is that you've got your landholder and you've got a market. And in many cases in New Zealand, like the landholders knew that carbon markets were a thing and they knew that they had some trees, but then they try to access that market and they hit all of these different obstacles around the compliance obligations and costs and risks and modeling. And then it's not just one market, actually, it's 3 different markets, because there's the compliance market, which people are most familiar with in New Zealand, the ETS. There's also voluntary carbon markets, and there's also net zero product claims you might want to make. And if you're someone who's got a million different things on their plate and you encounter all of these obstacles and you find your way through, as often as not, they were just hitting one of the many obstacles and giving up. And it gets more complicated than that because landholders generally don't exist in a vacuum, even just them in the market. There's also all of these other stakeholders like consultants and developers and supply channel partners and businesses looking to make net zero claims. And they're dealing not just with one landholder, but with tens or hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands. And that introduces not just the obstacles that the landholder has, but also all of these other complications around continuity of services and management of engagement and data and a registry and planning and a whole heap more compliance obligations. And in the discussions we had with them, we realized that all of this stuff is being solved at the moment. I mean, this is probably not an exclusive statement, but for the most part, with a combination of sort of emails and phone calls and spreadsheets that are passed back and forth and hand-maintained models and in many cases, non-compliant financial processes, intermingled customer data, and it's a really big mess. And this is increasing friction and reducing market access, which means that the incentives are less effective, which means that we get less forest, less carbon sucked out of the atmosphere, and basically nobody in the ecosystem gets what they actually want, which is a well-functioning market. So we saw an opportunity for us to create a platform that connected these. We started out mostly by connecting landholders to markets, and we're now in the process of expanding that platform for other participants in the marketplace. We're a technology company and a products company, really. We have been working in the services sector for the last 2 years to get this product up and running, but really now we want to turn it into a platform that everybody in the space can use to help it scale and be most effective. In terms of what we've achieved so far, this is taking back to some of what Wim just mentioned, we've mapped the forest and carbon stocks of 1.9 million hectares of New Zealand so far. We're now in the process of dramatically scaling that up. And we've already paid out roughly $25 million in carbon, which has been in many cases turned into cash to landholders in New Zealand for their forest. And we've got 265 ETS registrations either completed or in process at the moment, and something like 310 customer contracts, again, still growing. And that's in sort of under 2 years since we really launched the product. That's a bit of background on us. Into carbon markets. So there's compliance and voluntary carbon markets, and I'll try and cover both of them, but a lot of this focuses on the interactions and the relationships between the two. They've both got two key elements, really, though. There's supply. In our ideal world, that's the creation of carbon removals. There are also some variants of supply, which is the creation of avoided emissions, but that has issues, which I'll get to later. And these removers, like I'm calling them removers now, before they were landholders, they create removals. They've got obligations around the quality assurance of those removals, and they need funds because for the most part, whatever you're doing, generating carbon removals has some opportunity cost of some form and often some real costs. And so you have to find a way to fund it if you want it to happen and have it happen at scale. On the other side of the relationship, we've got demand, which is from emitters, which have some combination of compliance obligations in a compliance market, or voluntary goals that they've set for themselves and they want a way to achieve. And either way, generally what they need to achieve those goals is removals. And then in between, you have a market which does what pretty much every market since the dawn of civilization does. It looks to connect supply with demand. And what's very interesting, because a lot of people, they know about voluntary carbon markets because that's the thing which is sort of a consumer-facing opportunity and people talk about. What people might not realize is that the global compliance carbon market last year just crossed $100 billion. This is the sort of aggregate taxes or ETS fees collected around the world for carbon for compliance purposes. Like people don't have an opportunity of whether they participate or not. And it's interesting to look at that in contrast to the voluntary carbon market, which last year, I think last year it might have actually been smaller because of the recession. But either way, it's tiny in comparison. And something like my view on this, and I think it's reasonably widely held, is that voluntary carbon markets will not solve climate change. It would be the same as hoping that like a voluntary tax scheme would provide a government with all the revenues it needed to run. Like you get some interaction, but it's always limited. If you want to actually address this 40 gigatons of emissions, either we somehow find a way that it's cheaper to not emit than to emit, or we have to force people to do it. Like the entire petroleum sector is not just going to voluntarily decarbonize absent incentives. It has to be compliance. And in the New Zealand, the ETS, like for all that it gets its share of criticism and people frustrated with it, it actually does a lot of stuff really well. Like it has put a price on carbon for most of the New Zealand economy, with the exception of agriculture. And unfortunately, agriculture is something like 48% of our emissions, but still pretty much any activity that you undertake in New Zealand, getting from place to place, running your heater in your house or your office, all of our industrial activity, essentially all of our waste sector, or any forest that you chose to cut down, there's a dollar price that you face for doing that, which means that there's a commercial incentive to not do it, which is what we want. We want people pushed in the direction of using less carbon. But the ETS does also have some issues, and this is not going to be an exhaustive list, and perhaps it's also not an complete one, but key things are that there's no incentives in ag, and incentives go in both directions. Like in some cases, it might be that there's activities like soil carbon removals that could be incentivized. It's also that there's no price on methane emissions in New Zealand, which means that there's no incentive to deploy a technology which would reduce methane emissions. And this is leaving a lot of options on the table where we could reduce our greenhouse gas footprint. And that's why there's so much work in the sector around Hawake Kanoa and the ag pricing scheme to change this. There's also some very perverse incentives which have come up through the way that some sectors of forestry have been managed, including trees that aren't going in the places that we necessarily want them. And what I'm going to talk about today, most of all, is trees that are in the places that we want them, but we're not incentivizing them, so they're potentially even getting cleared to create space for trees that we don't want. Finally, and I'm not going to get into this today, but I think New Zealand's ambitions are actually pretty decent by international standards, yet at the same time they're woefully insufficient. Like we've got this goal of 50% reductions by 2030. 100% by 2050, with a little asterisk next to some agriculture and short-lived gases, which is like we're going to only reduce those 50%. It's clearly not enough. Like we already have massive climate issues at our current state now in 2023. Only 50% reducing our emissions 7 years from now is a disaster in my view, and I really hope that the sort of ongoing Paris-related agreements are going to lead to some more ambition for goals for all parties. But that's another rant. Given the ETS, a reasonable question would be, what is the point of the voluntary carbon market? In our view, it's to fill these gaps. Like the ETS does some things well, where it doesn't do things well. That means that in many cases, there's a complete absence of incentive mechanisms. People who are willing to take voluntary action can step in and plug those gaps. And in many cases, when they do something that works and is proven, it becomes not a voluntary carbon activity, but part of the compliance market. And in our view, that's really what you want. And that's actually the genesis of the ETS. Like New Zealand had voluntary carbon markets before it had the ETS. And many of the things that are now in the ETS had their start in voluntary carbon markets. And it's basically a really great incubator where you can find what's missing from the compliance framework, figure out a solution, prove it, and then push to get it incorporated into a broader framework that can be scaled up. So into voluntary claims and markets, because these are what many businesses actually like. Compliance, you don't get a choice, you just have to do it. Like you can vote, and I encourage people to vote for strong compliance carbon markets because they're a big part of the solution. But in the voluntary sector, you don't have to. It's your choice, your decision to make a contribution to try and help us decarbonize faster. And essentially the equation that everyone's trying to solve, whether it's in the voluntary sector or in the compliance sector, is to get this number to this equation to zero. So you've got your emissions, you take away all of your removals, which is emissions are greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere, removals are greenhouse gases being sucked out of the atmosphere, and then offsets, which is an increasingly controversial category, which is like that you apply against what's left, and you get your net position. If you can get this to be zero, especially if you do it without offsets, then you're net zero. That's the goal. There's a goal for now, and we want to get net negative, but let's start with zero. There's sort of a bunch of key standards bodies, which are the foundations on which these frameworks are built. One is the International Standards Organization, which has a couple of key standards. There are others. I'm not going to exhaustively list them here. These are largely like the nuts and bolts, like core accounting mechanics. Then there's the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which there's also multiple different standards. These in many cases are sort of like a superset of the International Standards Organization standards. And they set sort of broader frameworks as well as some principles and guidance on application. Then SBTI, it's something which, if you're closely involved in the space, you'll have heard a lot recently, Science-Based Targets Initiative. This is really more about not so much how you do your accounting, though there's increasingly a part of that, but the goals that you should set in order to be sort of sufficiently ambitious in where you're getting to with your accounting. So SBTI might say, for example, you should be at net zero by 2030. ISO and GHG define what net zero means. And then finally, the ICBCM, Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets, they are sort of a relatively recently created organization that looks to set some kind of globally accepted standards and principles about what an offset is and the market principles that should apply to the trade of offsets and the application of offsets. But within the category of offsets, and sort of the things which can be removals or offsets, there's two quite clearly distinct elements. Avoidance offsets and reduction offsets are basically units that are issued in recognition of something that you refrained from doing. So if you don't chop down a tree that you could have chopped down, you might get an avoided emission unit. If you don't build a coal power plant that you could have built, or you knock down a coal power plant that was there, you might get an avoided emission unit or a reduced emission unit. These are actually the majority of offsets that exist within the voluntary carbon market. There's like a lot of statistics on it's around about 90%. But the kind that are actually most useful for net zero are carbon removals. And they represent carbon that is freshly removed from the atmosphere. So it's not, I mean, arguably, if you've got a big forest, then it was removed over the last 100 years. But what we want is new ongoing removals. And for the most part, these come from forestry or direct air capture, but there's a lot of other potential, like regenerative agriculture can do it, accelerated rock weathering can do it, some classes of sort of blue carbon, like seaweed harvesting can do it. We really should be not looking to kind of pick one solution over another, but rather hold them all to a high standard of make sure that it's real, make sure that it's durable, it's not just sucked down one day and then it goes away the next, make sure that it's accurate, and some other points we'll get to later on. Increasingly, because so many of these offsets are avoided emission offsets, which don't really get us to net zero, and as I'll show in a moment, a lot of entities are looking to get their net position to zero without using offsets and by focusing on removals. And this is where I'm on slightly thinner ground, but my understanding is that the Science Based Target Initiative actually requires this. You are not on track for your SBTI unless you have a pathway to reach net zero through the neutralization of any residual emissions using removals. Offsetting your emissions with avoided emissions elsewhere doesn't count. And there's an important reason for that, that this is sort of the contrast of net zero, which is all of your emissions are neutralized, versus carbon neutral, which is sort of all of your emissions have been offset through somebody else's absence of emissions. And the reason for this is that, let's say you've got 10 megatons of emissions per year from some activity, and you neutralize those with 10 megatons of carbon removals. Like you've still got your emissions, but you've sucked out of the atmosphere an amount of greenhouse gases equal to that emissions. Now the Earth is happy. Not happy, it would rather it was negative. It was rather it didn't have 50 degrees and north of 2 this year, but it's in a pretty good state. The net impact on the atmospheric CO2 concentration through your portfolio of activities is now zero. Contrast this with avoided emissions, which is really, you've taken your 10 megatons of emissions, and you're kind of saying that you're offsetting those with somebody else's absence of 10 megatons of emissions that they might otherwise have created. This is what most carbon neutral claims using avoided emission offsets actually amount to. And clearly this is not going to lead to a happy planet. The consequence of this portfolio of activities is that we've still got an extra 10 megatons of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we've still got a pretty upset world. So you'll often hear the phrase, which has almost become a call to arms now, we can't offset our way to zero. That is very true if you are talking about avoided emission offsets or reduced emission offsets. However, you can neutralize your way to zero. And that is probably, per all of those UN forecasts, that's the way that we're going to get to zero as soon as we need to get to zero. Right, now onto native forests. And I better just check that I'm not running wildly out of time. Oh, it looks about on track. Here's an example of the sort of the gap between what the compliance market provides in New Zealand and what the voluntary market provides in New Zealand at the moment. This is a customer we have on Banks Peninsula, so hopefully close at hand to B-Link certainly, and some of you dialing in. And this is it's a reserve. The entire thing is covenanted, and most of it is sort of early to mid-stage regenerating native forest. Pretty much the whole thing, aside from some grassland that you can see here. Unfortunately, only 37 hectares of it is actually of a status and history that makes it eligible for the ETS, despite the fact that all of it is still regenerating and removing carbon from the atmosphere. And that's just due to the sort of the combination of the ETS rules and the ETS challenges in assessment and proof of status. Unfortunately, that leaves 120 hectares of regenerating biodiverse native forest, so the exact kind of forest that we most want to encourage and protect and restore, which is ineligible for any incentives under the emissions trading scheme. Today, like there's very promising signs that could change, but at least that's the state today. This is one of the holes that I mentioned in the ETS. What we've been doing with this property is working with them to get their ETS areas registered in the ETS, and then their other areas registered for voluntary carbon removal units that they can then partner up with an organisation to neutralise their emissions. And that provides finance for the forest to allow it to continue to sequester carbon and sequester more carbon, because there's an incentive to sequester more carbon because you've got money coming when you do. So again, incentive and means are the key things you're looking for, and that will increase your removals, give you additional removals in the future. It's also extremely important with this to get your bookkeeping right. Like, you don't want to be registering your ETS area for voluntary removals and double counting or double trading or double selling or anything like that. You have to be very careful to keep it all separated out, which is part of what the platform we've built delivers. And this allows this customer to, they work with the ETS for the ETS registered stuff, we work with an auditor for the non-ETS stuff, and they can sell these separate units of removals to ETS buyers or a tourism partner which they're working with. They could offset their, neutralize their internal operations. Or if they, like, let's say, for example, there was a primary sector, like a farming partner down the valley who was looking to neutralise their emissions, or even if they had their own farming activities on the grassland on the border of this property, they can neutralise those as well. So you can be quite sort of, you can pick and choose the activities that you undertake. The key thing is that you don't count any of your carbon removals twice, and you make sure that it's all accurate and durable and high quality and tracked. The result of this is that we're basically, we're not filling in all of the holes in the ETS by any means. There's a lot of other stuff there, and I'm very I wholeheartedly encourage some of the work that's being done in soil carbon and regenerative agriculture and direct air capture and all this kind of thing like that stuff. We need all of that. It desperately needs support. But we're filling in a couple of the gaps for native forest. And that unlocks incentives for the landholders, which means that we get more native forests restored, which means that more carbon incentives start to come into play, which means that there's less carbon in the atmosphere. Like, these are the cycles that you want to try and create, in my view, using the voluntary carbon market. And if you do it well and you can prove it, then ideally it ends up in a compliance carbon market as well. And that's when it really starts to get to scale, because the compliance market is where the bulk of the funds and the money is. So the carbon removals that we're creating through these voluntary mechanisms, like, they do remove carbon. That's one of the key criteria. We only issue units for carbon removals, not for avoided emissions or reduced emissions. You can only use them once. We track them on a registry to ensure that. They're permanent. We set a durability obligation of 100 years. They're transparent. This is all available in a publicly facing tool that we provide, where any given unit has an ID. You can query for it. You can trace them. They're accurate. We present the methodology by which it's calculated, and they can be certified as removals under ISO 1464-1, which is pretty key, because you want to be able to make these claims in connection with an overall business objective, because the business is like effectively donating money to that activity, and the benefit for them is that they get to make a particular claim in connection with it. And the result is that you can get to a net zero status, but you can do it in a way that provides a stronger story than some other forms of carbon neutrality using, say, international offsets from some renewable energy project, and that you've removed carbon, you've supported native forests, you're generally, with a massive co-benefit, supporting native biodiversity as well through your carbon payments. You can often act locally, like this forest may well be proximate to your actual business. And this actually also has international potential for New Zealand as an export, which is seen in the next example, where we worked with New Zealand Merino and Lake Hawea Station to provide to all birds a net zero shoe. And the key thing, like, they've called this moonshot, they wanted to do it without offsets. And that doesn't mean without removals, obviously. It's not a gross emission zero shoe, but they wanted all of the emissions of that shoe to be neutralized with removals that occurred within the shoe's supply chain. So for that, you need to be very careful that you don't count the removals anywhere else as well. Fortunately for Lake Hawea Station, we know exactly where all of their ETS forest is registered, because we manage it for them, which means that when we were looking at the removals we could use to support all birds' claim, we could explicitly exclude all of the ETS stuff and make sure nothing was counted twice. You'll see a lot of this area here. It looks like a weird thing to be including in a recognition of carbon removals because it's all sort of alpine grassland. The reason that we allow the polygons to be drawn like this is that it makes administration of the registration much easier. But you can see down the bottom, this is actually the carbon removals that the vision model is awarding to the land. So this is where the AI really comes in. It's not recognizing any carbon sequestration on any of these upper slopes. It knows that all that's there is grass and that it's basically not growing. It's only rewarding removals to the areas of vegetation that are growing and are not in the ETS. And in this case, we issued 2,500 individual tokens for that, each representing a ton of CO2 equivalent removed and durably stored in regenerating native forest. Each of these has a unique ID and a location, and they can be tracked using a tool that we have that's publicly facing back to the area of the farm that they came from, so that anybody can go and review and check its history and make sure that it's still there and it hasn't been sold to anybody else. All of this requires a whole heap of sort of issuance tracking and ownership tracking and transaction monitoring, which we provide within our systems, and we also look to integrate with other registry providers in this space to make sure that sort of it's not really our ambition to be a marketplace. We've been working in the case of the property that I showed before, we're working with Carbon Z, which was a marketplace that the trades went through. And like we just look to enable the landholder to bring their supply to the market for whichever buyer they're looking to work with or whichever internal goals they happen to have. So sort of final comment, if you're looking to make a voluntary claim, like the ETS is actually very good at creating and supplying carbon removals. That's what all of the post-89 forest, when you get a post-89 NZU within the ETS, that represents a ton of carbon durably removed from the atmosphere. I wouldn't say that it's a bad thing to be using those NZUs in your voluntary carbon claims. Like it's probably, on balance, I'd say it's certainly better than doing nothing. But really, I think the thinking with any voluntary market activity should be look to fill the gaps that are in the compliance market. Like if a certain activity is already well served by the compliance market, you can chip in there as well, but you're already paying for, like, there's roughly $2 to $3 billion a year that we collectively are paying into the ETS to buy various sources of auctioned NZUs or removal NZUs from forestry. I think you're probably going to get the most value from your dollar if you focus on filling the gap, like find something that the ETS isn't effective for, and then use that to underwrite your neutrality claims that you're looking to make, rather than just kind of doubling up on something that's already got a market like forestry NZUs. Now, I should qualify. This may change in terms of the impact with some of the future ETS reforms. Like if the markets are split, there's no longer a viable market for forestry NZUs, the market price isn't high enough to support native restoration or something like that, then the equation changes. This is just sort of how we sort of see the landscape today. And all of this together, like if you're a business working in the space, this is what gets you on your path to carbon net zero at an individual business level. The key parts are reduce your emissions as much as you can. Like there's phrases that are often thrown around like wherever possible. Like if you've got enough money, almost anything's possible. It's really wherever economically viable, I think, is what the refrain should be. And a good guide for economic viability is how much can you increase your removals? Because if you reduce your emissions and you're getting to net zero, anything that you've got to pay left over, you've got to pay for with removals. And these are increasingly scarce, and they'll get more scarce as more people increase their ambitions. So it's really in your own selfish economic interest, quite aside from being the best thing from the planet, to figure out everything you can viably do to reduce your emissions and then do it. And then source removals that are the best removals that you can, supporting the best actions that are aligned with your goals that you can, and look to get this to zero. If you can, like, I think in a perfect world, the distinction between removals and offsets would go away. We would like to see the only form of offset be a removal offset. We're not there yet. I don't think it's going to happen in the short term. I wouldn't go so far as to say that all offsets are bad. I think that there are some project developers who are fantastic and they're doing really good work. The challenge is that it's sometimes quite hard to tell the difference between those and the terrible ones. And there's a lot of stuff historically in the market that's really pretty much junk, as a lot of the reporting in The Guardian earlier this year revealed that 90% of various units they raised questions about. But yeah, get to net zero. And a final request, just generally, compliance, carbon markets are probably going to be the thing that saves us. Support them, work to understand, well, I won't just say support them, understand them. like, hopefully once you understand them, you'll see how they work and you'll support them. But my only real request is just understand them, because we think they're critical and we want to see them thrive and grow. That's me done. Back to you, Wim, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Nick. And we do have some questions already online. So for the people that are listening in to us, there is a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. So if you wiggle your mouse, you'll probably see that, and you can actually add the question into the Q&A bar. Halfway through your presentation, Nick, there was somebody in the room that said, great information so far. With regard to the Banks Peninsula example, if the trees are already existing, how does this count as removal when it's not new planting?
Yeah, great question. And that's been a regular one that comes up. I got a question the other day, is like, did this icebreaker project, sorry, Allbirds project, lead to any new carbon removals? And like, so the removal unit from an accounting perspective, it's not awarded for a tree being planted. And it's actually very difficult to detect, like, was the tree planted? When was it planted? If it was planted 2 years ago, is it ineligible? If it's planted 2 years from now, is it eligible? There was some very promising stuff in MFE's commentary on the ag pricing consultation last November around the eligibility of existing forest, where they were essentially saying if it's subject to ongoing stock exclusion or ongoing pest control, then this could meet the threshold for additionality. But the key thing for removals accounting and those standards I presented is not when it was established, it's what it is doing. Like, the thing that we want to incentivize is carbon being sucked out of the atmosphere. If you pay for that, like if you can monitor the tree and see how much carbon did it suck out of the atmosphere and durably store last year, and attach an incentive to that, then you're going to create a strong motivation for those people with those kinds of forests to further enrichment plant them, better pest control them, better protect them. There is a long litany of failures of these mechanisms in New Zealand in recent history, of people clearing regenerating native scrub because it wouldn't be eligible for ETS incentives, so that they could plant pine trees, which they can then register with the ETS. Like, this is by far not unheard of, and it's a real problem. So in a nutshell, the removal is just, did you last year remove a ton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere? And are you now committing to durably store that ton of carbon dioxide for the next 100 years with penalties on you if you do anything that results in a reversal? That's what a removal means, rather than there being any test on planting, which is great, because it means for all of our forests where we can't determine when it was planted, we still have a mechanism that can incentivize increased removals and drive that increase in removals that the UN says we need.
Thank you very much, Nick. Trevor has a question of you. You didn't mention biochar, which is currently by far the largest contributor to the voluntary market. Do you consider working in that space here in New Zealand? And Trevor thinks that it would be good if we open up that discussion.
Yeah, certainly I'm strongly in favor of opening up the discussion. I actually only know a limited amount about biochar. My understanding is that there's sort of you have, you throw a bunch of, for those listening, like if you heat wood, for example, in an oxygen deprived environment, you end up with something which is kind of still contains all of that carbon, but is in a form that's very stable in the ground. And so often you like create biochar from forestry waste and then you bury it, and it's a good way of sequestering carbon in the earth. I strongly support that as a carbon removal activity that's durable. At the moment, when you cut down a forest, you have to give back all of the carbon credits for it, which I think is right and correct. But if you find a way to effectively repackage that carbon and store it durably, I think you should get carbon credits for it. And the ETS doesn't at the moment. I think it's being worked on. Would be great to see it happen. I wasn't aware that it was the largest contributor to the voluntary carbon market, so I'd actually thought that it might be a big contributor of carbon removals, but I think sort of avoided deforestation, avoided emissions for avoided deforestation are one of the biggest sources of voluntary carbon market units, and they're one of the things that we don't think should be used as an offset. As far as CarbonCrop, considering working in that space, certainly I'm very happy to chat to anybody about it, and if there's anything I can do to help, then I'm keen. But we've sort of got our hands pretty full with what we're doing just in our focus areas at the moment. But if you need someone to say loud and shrill, we should focus on like mechanisms that provide incentives for biochar where it's economically possible, I wholeheartedly support it. Like, I think it would be great if there was an industry for that in New Zealand as well.
Hey, Nick, thank you very much for that. There are a couple of questions about how do you calculate the carbon sequestration of native forests? And another question is, how do you take into account the different native species, and how do you do that? So I see that those two questions are related to each other.
Yeah, that's one that's going to be very hard for me to do justice to in a short answer. There's like presentations that we've got that run for an hour just on that topic. But in short, there's a bunch of fantastic work that's been done in New Zealand, I think, especially by Manaaki Whenua, over the last 2 decades, which is basically longitudinal studies, which means like over time studies of the carbon sequestration rates in forests of different types and in different environments. It's still fairly sparse. We need more funding for that kind of activity to help scale it up. And one of the things that carbon markets for the output of those forests does is help provide a source of monitoring funds. But essentially, you measure a bunch of trees, and then you come back and measure them again later and see how much they've grown in biomass, and that gives you your carbon sequestration. How we monitor the carbon sequestration of native forests across large areas and different types is by using, I mean, AI is going to sound like a very glib answer, but basically we find the trees that we know about, and then we use applied machine learning to find other trees which are very similar in characteristics and attributes and environment to those trees that we know about. And then you can infer that these other trees are sequestering carbon at a similar rate to the ones that you've calibrated your models to. And then you can go back and look at it again and again and make sure, is the forest growing? Has any of it been cleared? Because if it's been cleared, you go to the landholder and say, buddy, you sold that carbon, it wasn't yours to cut down. You've got to go back to the market now and like compensate those people who bought those credits, which is, again, a key part of the incentive mechanism. Like, you don't want people just growing forest and then once they've got the money running off, which is why New Zealand's a great place to do it, because we've got very strong rule of law. And, you know, you can be confident that if you have a contract with someone and they've sold you an item within it, then you'll be able to enforce that contract, which is much more difficult in some areas of the world.
Thank you very much, Nick.
And sorry, to the next question there on the same kind of topic. Yes, we do take into account different species as well as the different growing environments, which is sort of at least as significant. Like, you can have similar species like Manuka or Kanuka, for example. The carbon sequestration rates in a warm environment close to sea level with good rainfall are just massively different to when you're getting up close to the tree line and it's cold and there's not a lot of rain.
What happens if there's a fire on a carbon removal forest?
Yep, another great question. So we use the same mechanism as what's been implemented under the emissions trading scheme, which is essentially like, you have to be very careful not to create big disincentives for market engagement for a landholder. Like, if you said to the landholder, you'll get some money for this carbon, but if anything ever happens to make your forest catch fire, you're going to be basically bankrupt. Then they'll go, well, on balance, I won't participate in this market, and your incentives essentially don't work. What we instead do is allocate a fraction of the credits to a reserve pool, which is essentially like a collective buffer for all projects. And if there's any loss within that area, then the forest stops earning any credits. So they do still have a massive commercial incentive to protect their forest and make sure that it doesn't catch fire, rather than just being like, no, I don't care, I'm insured. But the carbon credits that have been bought in connection with that forest are substituted with carbon credits from this collective reserve pool, which still exists somewhere else, but haven't been sold, have been held in reserve.
Okay, thank you so much, Nick. Hey, can we claim carbon credits on the removal for, no, let me start over. Can we claim carbon removals for orchard trees?
Within the ETS, you explicitly can't. I think the motivation is largely that, well, there may be two things, but a particular issue is that orchard crops are often subject to extensive silviculture, and it's usually not very long before they actually saturate in terms of carbon stocks. That said, I have heard of some stuff within sort of the hort industry, especially around viticulture, where the soil carbon can increase by a significant amount over time. Not my area of expertise, but broadly speaking, no, not within the ETS. Within what we're doing with voluntary market credits, in principle, yes, you could, because you're removing carbon, and that's what we're looking to incentivize, but we're specifically looking to incentivize carbon removals in native biodiverse forest. And so there can be limitations there depending, I mean, most orchard trees are exotic species and they're not really where our focus is. So a bit of a caveat there, but it's not what we're aiming for the most part.
Hey, Nick, what if I want to bring in some new native plantings? Can you discuss the scope for that?
Yeah, so you can, in principle, you can register in the ETS anything that qualifies as post-89 forest land, and that includes new native plantings if they're more than 1 hectare in aggregate area of that's more than 30 meters in average width and is going to grow to more than 5 meters in height and above. Short story, get in touch with us, we can help you figure out the eligibility. There is a large category of new native plantings that are actually sub-ETS criteria, not because of their age, but because of their geometry, like they're too small or they're too skinny, you've got sort of a big riparian strip or whatever. All of those we do actively incentivize with native CarbonCrop units, and we're very much in favor of. However, the economics can still be pretty challenging. Like, I mean, it's still very difficult to make the numbers stack up for new direct establishment of native plantings. But there's a lot of work happening there, but certainly you can. I think we just need more and stronger incentives, and that's where the ETS reforms that have been proposed actually have some promising elements.
There is a question how the voluntary market is being policed.
Yep, great question. It really comes back to those different frameworks that I mentioned earlier on. I mean, in principle, as long as you're making claims that are true and correct and defensible, then you're in the clear in New Zealand in terms of the sort of various consumer rights. But really, you want to be doing something that can be linked back to some generally accepted standard, and that's where the ISO standard and the greenhouse gas protocol are really the key ones that a lot of others are building on top of in various forms. So I'd say you should be looking for someone who is making a voluntary claim that has been assessed and then audited or otherwise verified to ISO 14064-1 or ISO 14067, depending on whether it's sort of a business that's saying it's net zero or a product that's claimed to be net zero. But it's through those standards, essentially.
Thank you so much.
I will just add on to that, though, that I think educated buyers in this space should be looking to support innovation. Like biochar was mentioned earlier. It may be that it's quite difficult to actually get a biochar project to the stage that it's fully certifiable. That doesn't mean that it's a bad project, and it may be that that's actually the activity that is like it's on the leading edge of innovation. It is the thing that most desperately needs voluntary support. Like what Allbirds did that was really great was essentially say, we're doing this slightly different to the normal way. And we're acknowledging that it's slightly different to the normal way, which we just to go out and buy a bunch of offsets from dubious projects. And we're doing that because we think it's better. We think that there's flaws in the system. And like all of those standards, they are under continual review and refinement as the voluntary carbon markets are to try and make them better and more effective, because we're clearly, where we are is not a good state. The problem is far, far from solved. We need innovation. And I think we need to find ways to encourage that innovation and kind of balance innovation with certainty, because often it's the people who are on the leading edges who are doing the things which are the least certain. But if you disincentivize that too strongly, you just don't get innovation. And then we're in real trouble because, again, status quo is not good.
I agree with you there. How do you account for pest control?
We don't explicitly account for it in our model yet. We just try to model the attributes of forests which are subject to pest control or will therefore sequester more carbon than they otherwise would. However, we've just released an app called, like a big thing with pest control is, can you verify the extent of the pest control activities and the impact of those pest control activities? Because you could go and shoot a deer once every 6 months and you might not have very much impact on the level of browsing. You could have a super extensive fencing and trapping and control program, which is extremely effective. We've just released an app called Field Scan, which aims to put this power in the hands of the general public and landholders. That, like, a key thing with evidence collection is, can you collect it economically and is it verifiable? And this app is essentially an authenticated photo that includes the location information and date information and the person who took it. So you could go out and kind of say, I was here. Here's a picture of this particular area of forest and evidence of the lack of browsing activity, which is actually the key thing. Rather than have you control your pests, it's have you achieved the goal of controlling your pests, which is reducing the negative impacts that those pests would otherwise have. So we're working on that just by basically empowering data collection to support the models.
Thank you so much, Nick. I think we are heading towards one of the last questions, and that is, as a business owner, there are a lot of external pressure to offset via ETS registered units. As with the Allbirds example, do you offer advice to businesses how to communicate the use of the voluntary units instead?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Like I know this is part of the one of the proposals for the emissions trading scheme as well. I find it somewhat strange that there's pressure to offset using ETS units, because pretty much every business activity in New Zealand has already had ETS units applied to it. Like if you fly a domestic flight in New Zealand, the kerosene that went into that plane has to be 100% compensated by ETS units. Like, why would you get ETS units to do it again? I'm not saying it's bad, but it is a little bit strange. We don't directly offer advice on accounting. We're trying to just focus on the supply side and separate ourselves a little bit from the accounting, because otherwise we end up with a potential conflict of interest. But we work here with Canary Carbon and businesses which are doing work in the space to help businesses get their inventory assessed and neutralize their emissions using removals. And they do not have to be carbon crop removals. In fact, as I said before, I'd like to see lots of innovation in the space across lots of different classes of activity. Native forest outside the ETS is one that we think is very important, but I encourage the use of biochar credits, for example, or if somebody's got a direct air capture plant, then by all means use those. Find the areas that actually where innovation is happening and they need support. And then, I'd say, if you can, and your business is in a position where you're able to be bold, follow Allbirds' example and say, yeah, we're doing it differently to what the status quo is. We looked at ETS removals and they're actually not what we want to use for these reasons. We were using these other removals instead, and these are our claims, and those claims are accurate and verified and audited, and we think this is the right thing to do. I do want to say though that there are some, in some cases, people are buying ETS removals for native forest at far above the market rate for the ETS. I'd actually say that's a good thing. As we discussed before, it can be very hard to get a native planting project up off the ground. The ETS commodity price isn't really sufficient yet. If you're paying $100 a unit for native units, because that's what it takes to kind of get project economics over the line, you're not necessarily supporting technical innovation, but you're certainly supporting a project that might not happen otherwise, and that's really important as well. So I applaud that subset of voluntary buyers.
Nick, thank you so much, and thank you so much for this. And I think we all learned a lot. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us. If you think that this was interesting, we have a number of events coming up. On the 26th of July, we'll be talking about the future of biosecurity for the New Zealand dairy sector. Proteins for Life, we're going to look at potential meat alternatives. Professor Jim Morton will talk to us in our Excellent series. And on the 15th of August, we are talking about a living laboratory project with Dr. Rachel Bryant. So thank you very much for tuning in. Nick, thank you again for taking the time and talking to us. And thank you very much. And if you thought it was good, be social. Thank you very much, and see you next time.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the opportunity and your time.